Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Greetings, people of Earth. As an astrobiologist, I study the story of Earth in the context of comparative planetology, the way in which our planet is similar and different from other planets, what we've learned from our voyages to other planets. If I could have the first slide, please. And the perspective that gives us on Earth, and in particular, I'd like to address right now, for a few minutes, the perspective that gives us on ourselves. I think the cosmic view of humanity gives us a very wide context for optimism. Consider that we are the product of 13.7 billion years of cosmic evolution and 4.5 billion years of Earth evolution. And over this time, our planet has been through a lot of changes, including many catastrophic changes. But there's undoubtedly something new and extraordinary going on here on this planet right now. One way to look at this is there has never before been a geological force aware of its own existence. When we study the deep history of Earth, we find that we are not the first life form to come along and radically transform the planet. There have been other planet wreckers before us. For instance, these little guys, the Cyanobacteria, they look innocent enough, don't they? But 2.5 billion years ago, they discovered a new energy source, thought it was great, let's exploit it all around the planet, polluted the atmosphere in a way that led to a lot of extinction and destroyed the climate, probably the worst climate crisis ever in the history of the planet. That gas they discovered was oxygen, that energy source they discovered was solar energy. So we're not the first planet wreckers even in the search for energy, and yet we look at our time and we know there's something different. There's something going on here that is not the same as those other even biologically driven changes. What is it? Maybe it's cognitively and socially driven technological change, a geological change agent that is starting to become self-aware. And that brings responsibility. A deep study of Earth's history reveals that climate has always been changing. And now we understand those changes to be largely driven by interactions with the other planets, gravitationally, these long-term rhythmic changes in Earth's orbit. The change in the shape of the orbit, the change in the tilt and orientation of Earth's spin. All of these are wobbling over different time scales. This guy in the upper right here, Milutin Milankovic, a Serbian mathematician, figured this out while a prisoner of war in World War I, published it in 1920. Everybody said it was nuts, the planets can't affect Earth climate. Went to his grave right before the start of the space age in the 1950s, considered kind of a crank. And then in the 70s, when we discovered the real history of climate on Earth with ice cores, we realized he was right, and that Earth does have these climate fluctuations that are closely correlated with these changes in Earth's orbit. So climate has changed time and again, and it turns out that we, human beings, in our deep evolution, our deep history as a species, have an intimate and complex relationship with climate change. This is not the first time we've dealt with it. There's a scientist here at the Smithsonian, Rick Potts, who, I don't know, maybe he's here. Hi, Rick, if you're here. He's a great guy. He's been, for more than 30 years, the director of the Center for Human Origins here. He's a paleoanthropologist, and he goes to Africa every summer and digs up clues to our deep history. And what Rick and his colleagues have found, you can see over here on the right, is that many of the most important innovations that made us humans, things like upright walking, and the domestication of fire and different kinds of tool use and social innovations came about as a result of challenges that were presented to us by climate change. Periods of climate chaos were when these big innovations happened that made us human. And the climate of Africa has been driven into ice age and hothouse by these same cycles that have affected the whole Earth. And that is a lot of what made us who we are today. So we have literally in our DNA the ability to respond to climate change by reinventing ourselves in innovative ways. The origin of Modern humans, of course, is not completely known, but one strong possibility is that it was here at Pinnacle Point near the southern tip of Africa, a site that has been excavated and studied where there was early habitation by possibly some of the first modern humans. And this is a site where our predecessors retreated when there was an ice age in Africa, and the human race, or what led to the human race, our predecessors, almost went extinct. We could no longer be hunter-gatherers in the same way because the ice age meant that the game was not running freely over Africa. We had to invent a new way to live, and these people at Pinnacle Point invented what we call long-chain complex recipe technology, which is any kind of technological innovation where the products are not obvious from the nature of the ingredients, the things you start off with, and so it's a complex thing that's figured out and has to be taught from generation to generation. So along with this technology comes the social technology of inventing more sophisticated language, more sophisticated social cooperation. And at this same site is some of the first places where we find pigments and evidence of art and personal adornment. So we don't know if this is where we first became human, but it's considered a candidate. The amazing thing about this site is it's also at a time when the human race was driven almost to extinction. I mentioned we were down to perhaps 1,000 individuals or fewer, and we reinvented ourselves, survived largely off of shellfish and the ocean, and repopulated Africa, and then ultimately the world. So anyone who says that human nature is fixed in a way that prevents us from meeting our current challenges, I think they're just suffering from lack of imagination, lack of a deep view. In a sense, all of these steps in evolution had led us to becoming more human, more cooperative, more able to use technology to deal with environmental challenges, cooperating in larger groups. So maybe the challenge really is that we are not quite human enough and have to go that one step to being able to apply those same capacities that have saved us before in a global cooperative effort. And I think our deep evolution shows that we're capable of it. If anybody tells you that human nature makes it impossible for us to fix our problems, ask them this question. Can you imagine trying to describe to a hunter-gatherer 100,000 years ago what a modern city is like, how we live today? It would have been very hard, probably impossible. Now, maybe it's just as hard for us to imagine that sustainable global civilization that we'll have a few thousand years from now. We are creatures of reinvention. There's no reason why we can't keep going. An evolutionary view of where we are reveals reason to believe that we have the capacity to survive and to thrive. Here's one example. When I talk about cognitive change becoming a new force on Earth, there are different ways that can play out, of course. In broad strokes, there are two ways that it can play out. One is unintended, inadvertent change, which is destabilizing and dangerous. Another is intentional change using foresight, which can be stabilizing and lead to safety. Well, consider the problem with the ozone hole. It began as something scientists discovered that we were harming an essential life support component of our planet. And so it began as one of these unintended consequences of new technology, but there was a conversation, a lot of arguments, and ultimately global agreements and new applications of technology that led to a success story. The ozone hole is on its way to being fixed. So this is an example of unintended consequence, but it's also an example of intentional interaction with the global biosphere. In the future, we will have other problems to deal with along these lines. If we imagine changing our role to playing a constructive role on the Earth from getting over our current vandalism stage, then there will be future opportunities and I would say obligations to intervene in the long run. Our planet exists in a solar system with lots of objects that cross the orbit of the Earth. This is real data. These are all known Earth crossers. And just as the dinosaurs got knocked out, a future mass extinctions would happen if we let them, but we would not have to. Also, over here in the lower left is a reminder that climate is not benign over the long run. We could prevent the next ice age I think ultimately this is not a problem for another 50,000 years probably, but I think we have to learn to think of ourselves as a geological entity on geological timescales, and part of the maturity of the human race will be to see things coming and figure out how we want to deal with them. Ultimately, I think we'll be able to save more species than we're threatening. The metaphors we use to describe ourselves are important, and I think sometimes limiting. We tend to use metaphors of cancer, disease, and crime. It's understandable where those metaphors come from if you look at our recent behavior on the planet, but I think we have to be very careful not to proscribe our future behavior. And I would urge that we think of other metaphors that are also true, that imply the possibility of growth and maturity, the metaphor of childhood, the metaphor of the driver realizing she's at the wheel of a rig that she better learn how to control. There are other ways to think of ourselves. I want to end with this last minute, if you'll indulge me, in reading a brief snippet from my book, Earth in Human Hands, that just came out, which specifically addressed the taxonomy of optimism. Right now, the subject of the future is rife with anxiety. Visions of apocalypse dance in our heads. The topic of the Anthropocene is often associated with doom and gloom, with an "is the earth ruined" mentality. This is understandable, but it's not the whole story. Let's not dwell on these prophecies to the point where they become self-fulfilling. I propose that, on the contrary, the true Anthropocene is something that should be welcomed. Though it is yet only in its infancy, it can be glimpsed. Don't fear it. Learn to shape it. It is the awareness of ourselves as geological change agents that, once propagated and integrated, will provide us with the capacity to avoid doom and take our future into our own hands. Understandably, we are uncomfortable with our role as reluctant planetary engineers. Discomfort sometimes manifests as self-loathing and denial, but this is our task, and we can't afford to wallow. It's time to human up. We have to stand and face it, get up on our big bipedal frames and look in the mirror. Wake up to find out that we are the eyes of the world. Earlier in this chapter, I described flavors of pessimism. There are flavors of optimism, too. There's cosmic optimism, stemming from the belief that the universe in its vastness bends toward life and intelligence, and that what happens here doesn't really matter because there's plenty more where we come from. There's data-driven and historically based optimism, which focuses on positive indicators, of which there are many. Poverty, malnutrition, infant mortality are all in retreat globally. Levels of education are on the rise. Communication continues to become cheaper and easier. Population is plausibly heading towards stability. Solar and wind energy are getting cheaper and will continue to do so. These are all trends toward human freedom and environmental sustainability. There's pragmatic optimism. We really don't know what is going to happen, so why not spread hope and encourage engagement? Exponential technological innovation is transforming our world in surprising and accelerating ways. Possibilities that until recently seemed magical are now imminent, rendering the future frightening and exhilarating, but above all, unpredictable. Where there is uncertainty, there is also hope and choice and room for faith in ourselves. I believe we're just getting started on this planet. Nobody knows the odds of our being able to navigate the evolutionary obstacles before us, but there is a real hope, and it is this: that our evolving technological capacities can allow us to maximize our innate social prowess, equipping us to meet the novel threats we have accidentally created, and to become something new in the process. We have done this before. Thank you.